Thank you. We will start, so we can keep to our schedule. First I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and their elders past, present and future, upon whose land we are meeting here tonight. We have a little order of proceedings in order to launch Gonzalo's fantastic book, as you can see there, and I think there are one or two copies left if anyone would like to purchase them. A Transnational History of the Australian Animal Movement, 1970 to 2015, published by Palgrave and Macmillan. So we will start, we'll have two speakers, Peter Singer and Glenys Oogjes, who will each talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will ask Gonzalo to talk to his book, and then we'll have a Q&A. Monday night, perfect night for it. Our first speaker, Professor Peter Singer. Peter is the R.W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Centre for Human Values at Princeton and Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne, which is why you probably see him wandering around sometimes. Very happily, if you can nab him, will come and speak to a group you might have, or a lecture or a tutorial. Sorry, Peter. He really is obviously best known for his famous and influential work, Animal Liberation, A New Ethics for Our Treatment of Animals, which was published in 1975. In recent years, of course, Peter's written a number of books around the whole question of how are we to live and the whole problem of how are we to live ethically in this era, which is rapidly becoming known as the Anthropocene. He will speak about his involvement in the history that is presented in Gonzalo's book and why it is so important to have a good historical account of the animal movement in Australia. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here to participate in launching Gonzalo's book. And congratulations, Gonzalo, on writing the book. Of course, I've known about it for a while. Gonzalo interviewed me for the book, as well as looking at papers that I donated to the National Library of Australia. So it's great to see it actually come to fruition here. I do want to say a little bit about being involved in this process that is very well described here. The book tells a lot of stories from the animal movement. Each chapter starts with some incident or episode and moves out from there. So it's a readable account of the movement, but it's also got some theory in it about how social movements get up and work, and so there are things to think about at that theoretical level as well. For me, in reading it, of course, it was a very interesting experience to see how Gonzalo presents the movement and the aspects of it. He gives, to me, very flattering significance to animal liberation in terms of the inspiration it provided for some of the key players in the book. And he then tells the story about the various people who organised that movement and got it started. And one thing that I think is really significant is the prominence of women in the animal movement in Australia. I know Gonzalo invited both Christine Carnan and Paddy Mark to come tonight, and they are certainly central figures in the movement. Fortunately, Glenys is able to be here, so at least one of who I would regard as the three key women in the animal movement, in the history of the animal movement, are with us. But really, even if I played a role in terms of ideas, presenting ideas, and did, as I'll say in a moment, get involved at a more practical level as well, it was Christine Carnan in particular who, after reading Animal Liberation, had the idea that there needs to be an organisation, Animal Liberation, in Australia, and with support from Milo Dunphy at the Total Environment Centre in Sydney, and of course with great support from her husband Jeremy, did get that going. And I think she was the driving force in doing that and setting that up at the time. And then here in Victoria, Chris did that at a time when I was, well, part of the most important years I was overseas. Or I come back to Australia after writing Animal Liberation in '75. I was then away again for the second half of '78 and all of '79. And during that period, Patty Mark set up Animal Liberation in Victoria. She also read Animal Liberation and contacted Chris and asked if there was anything happening in Victoria, and there really wasn't. So she set up Animal Liberation in Victoria. And when I came back to Australia at the end of '79, I was invited to join that movement and was happy to do so. I remember a very small meeting which in St Kilda in what's now the Hall of Theatre Works, for those of you who know that little theatre in St Kilda, somewhere around there I think, with about 5 people present for the meeting that I went to. But we did have great hopes and ambitions, and in fact I'm going to show you one of those hopes and ambitions now. And to do that, I'm going to do a strip. Don't get alarmed. Not about to expose too much. It's more like Clark Kent, I guess. Superman. So this is the original, the first Australian animal T-shirt that I had. And although it says on it 1984, that is not the date of the T-shirt. That is the date by which Paddy hoped to abolish the battery cage in Australia. See the battery cage represented here. You can have a look at the back of it if you want. I'll model it. Thank you. So we were pretty optimistic about what we were going to achieve. But I think that's because it just seemed so obvious to Paddy, as it seemed to Chris, and it certainly seemed to me, that once you told people about how their eggs were being produced and the misery of the hens crowded into those small wire cages, that surely they were going to say, no, I won't buy those eggs. Maybe they would buy free-range eggs, or they wouldn't buy eggs at all. And it was pretty hard to get free-range eggs in Australia at that time. So we really hoped that, give it 5 years, we'll get our message across. From the time Paddy started it, and that we would succeed in doing that. Well, I guess you learn that change is harder to bring about than you might think if you only focus on the strength of the arguments as they appeal to us, and for that matter, the strength of the emotional appeal of telling people about the battery cage. So it was a very long struggle, and in fact it still is a long struggle, and I know that Glenys is working to this very day on getting rid of the battery cage in Australia, and it's encouraged people to write to the inquiry that's going on now, which we hope will finally result in that. But at least we do know that the battery cage has been abolished across the European Union, or at least the standard battery cage that existed then, and in California, and is being phased out by a lot of producers in the United States and other countries as well. But Gonzalo's book did make me think about, well, why was it so difficult for us to succeed? But it tells the story quite well, and it tells, for example, when through Chris Townend's quotes from her about how she would speak to meetings in the country particularly, and she would just feel this enormous amount of basically hatred against her for trying to tell farmers that they shouldn't be treating animals the way that they are, and the political difficulties that we had in getting members of parliament, whether state or federal, who might seem quite supportive when we went to talk to them, but getting them to actually do anything, which no doubt is itself related to the fact that even if we could persuade quite a lot of urban people of our views, there was certainly going to be rural seats at risk if anything that Animal Liberation wanted for farm animals was put into practice, and those rural seats then as now were very much in the minds of politicians. So I think the book tells that kind of story quite well. And it also brought me back to things that were not so vivid to me. But for example, one of the first things we tried to do was, as I said, it was difficult to even buy free-range eggs. We went vegan at the time. The vegans were very few in number. So even for ourselves, but also for the general public, we wanted to make free-range eggs available. But here in Victoria, and I think in other states as well, we had an egg board, the Victorian Egg Board, and it was legally required for egg producers to sell their eggs to the Victorian Egg Board, unless you were some very small, producing a really tiny number of eggs and selling on farm. You had to sell your eggs to the Victorian Egg Board, and the Victorian Egg Board didn't care how those eggs were produced. They just put their VEB stamp on them and shipped them out to anybody who wanted to sell them. So there was no way of telling in a supermarket whether the eggs you produced were from battery hens or free range. And overwhelmingly, of course, given that there was no price advantage, you couldn't get a higher price for free range eggs, they were battery eggs. So one of the first things we did was to try to get that changed. And as Gonzalo tells, we were eventually successful in getting that changed. And there was a fair amount of, if you like, just liberal free enterprise ideology in that, getting rid of this not really state control of the egg industry. So that's one important story. The other important story that I want to tell, I guess, concerns the setting up of the Australian Federation of Animal Societies, as it then was, which then eventually became the Australian and New Zealand Federation of Animal Societies, and today is known as Animals Australia. And Glenys will tell you, I'm sure, more about the later part of that. I just again wanted to tell you that, as the book indicates, Chris went to see Peter Nixon, who was a federal minister of primary industry, I think, at that time, and was talking to her about getting tax deductibility. He was talking to him about getting tax deductibility for animal societies, and he said basically, well, there's so many of you, you need to sort of speak with one voice rather than all these different voices, and that was the impetus for setting up the Australian Federation of Animal Societies, which I think has done a lot of very good things, although tax deductibility for animal welfare organisations in general, it has certainly not succeeded in getting. But there is some tax deductibility for some. So that's another development that we hadn't really foreseen. And again, that's something that started rather small as a federation, a lot of different organisations in the room. Chris and I set it up together. We organised an event at Monash University. I became the first chair of it, and Chris was the secretary. And we had a really interesting time for a few years in trying to keep this federation together. You can imagine we had in the federation, for example, a number of societies interested in protection of cats, and we also had some societies interested in protection of Australian wildlife, and they don't always go very well together. Some people get very offended if you suggest that their little logs could possibly be killing any wildlife. So, yeah, we had an interesting time, but it did eventually grow, and I think that story is also told in the book, and as I said, I won't preempt what Glenys might be saying, but it did become a successful organisation. So let me reflect a little bit on some of the more theoretical questions that Gonzalo discusses in terms of social movements. I don't have a lot of time for this, but why did social movements get going at this time? Why were they taken up, and in what way? To me, what was key certainly in my thinking about animal liberation, and I believe in starting off animal liberation movement, was that this was a time when there were a lot of protest movements of varying kinds, and we were familiar with the idea of women's liberation, as the feminist movement was then known, and of black liberation, and of gay liberation. So we had these models of liberation movements, and for me, therefore, once I started thinking about the idea of speciesism and the idea that we are biased or prejudiced in favour of our own species and against other species, this seemed quite closely parallel with what the women's liberation movement or the black liberation movement or the gay liberation movement were saying about biases that existed in that way. So it was a fertile time for setting up a new and different movement. And I think that is part of it. But also, although there were animal welfare movements, organisations existing, there wasn't something that was really speaking for farm animals in particular, and there was very little really that was speaking about more than dogs and cats and perhaps horses, which the RSPCAs around the country were doing. So I think there was also a vacuum there, and that's part of what was going on and why there were new movements. I think some of that is in Gonzalo's books. There are other broader theoretical claims that historians have discussed about the nature of movements and the extent to which they reflect personal ideas of people and opportunities for people to express themselves and to act in certain ways. I feel that the people I've got to know in the animal movement were people who really were deeply concerned about animals and about suffering, and that was the primary motivation. And I have to say that for me, that was also one of the great rewards of the movement, getting to know a lot of people who really were altruistic, were dedicated, were prepared to work extremely hard in order to make a difference to other beings who were never really going to be able to thank them for it or reciprocate. And I know there's still a lot of people in that movement doing that, and that to me is a very encouraging thing. And as many of them are chronicled in this excellent book, again, I congratulate you, Gonzalo, on writing the book. I'm really glad that it's going to be there always in libraries for people to pick up and see and learn about this movement, learn about the things that we accomplished through hard work and dedication, learn about the things that we've certainly not as yet accomplished, that we want to accomplish, and hopefully push it forward so that when another historian comes along, maybe in another 40 years, there will be a lot more successes to chronicle. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, very much. I forgot to introduce myself earlier. My name is Barb Creed from the School of Culture and Communication, and I coordinate the Human Rights and Animal Ethics Research Network with Jeanette and Lynn and a group of others. We meet every month. We have a reading group. If you want to find out more about us, put that into the School of Culture and Com, Human Rights and Animal Ethics Research Network. The acronym is ARRAY, so you probably shouldn't forget it. And we'd love to welcome new members each month if you would like to come along. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our second illustrious speaker for the night, Glenys Oogjes, CEO of Animals Australia. She's one of Australia's most experienced animal advocates. After obtaining a degree in behavioural science, Glenys turned her attention to animal protection and has spent much of her career getting animal welfare on government and community agendas, which, as we all know, is an incredible uphill battle in a way. She has contributed to numerous national reviews of codes of practice and animal welfare laws in each state and territory. Glenys has also worked to achieve greater protection for animals through representation on various government and industry standards and committees. So as you can imagine, her life is a very dedicated one and an incredibly busy one. Glenys will speak about the changes she's seen over the years in animal activism in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Is this working, do you think? First questions? Difficult to follow Peter. Peter is, of course, a real leader in our movement. I'd say the father of the movement, which I'm not sure he likes that title, but certainly it was my reading of animal liberation that, well, didn't start me in the movement as such, but actually gave me the very basis of my understanding of why I needed to be in this movement. I'd been tipped off, if you like, to the exploitation of animals through learning about cosmetic testing on animals. But when looking to see what else was happening out there, because I was so shocked, to then read Peter's book, put it all in perspective for me, and again shocked me, of course. And not unlike what, as Peter just said, once I learned about what was happening to animals in a systemic way across the board, and it wasn't just about callous cruelty by an individual person that finds themselves in court, but rather much of the hidden suffering. I too thought that we could immediately tell everybody about it, talk to people, and things would change, and here we are. So do excuse me if I read, but my problem is that I'll probably go off on so many tangents to tell you about the many anecdotes, which when reading Gonzalo's book certainly brought many of them back to me, of course. Changes have been significant within the movement, and I'm so pleased that Gonzalo has been able to chart those, because it's not very often that many people have an ability to read about what's happened in the past, and it's so important that we do. And his assessment and suggestions about the different strategies over the years certainly made me reflect, and that's an important thing to do. I was thinking today, while there's been coverage of the fire emergencies in the southeast of our state and in New South Wales, many people are thinking about people who've lost their homes or displaced, and the wildlife, the sheep, the cattle that have been burnt and may well be, as we sit here, be suffering tonight. So people learn about that through the news. What they don't know is the massive suffering. Most people don't know or don't want to know, that's another whole issue I won't go into, that is happening hidden in factory farms, on ships going overseas, in many places that people don't know about. And so people are not reacting, or not sufficiently reacting. There's so much suffering that's going on, and one could think that we haven't progressed, but of course we have, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I think that as I say, when I first started to learn about this, I wanted to tell others, and of course even my own family. I come from a dairy farm, so you can imagine that learning about what was going on, I wanted to tell them about it. And of course, to this day, almost 40 years later, none of them have gone vegan, and so it's a very difficult thing. And I think that's because we humans are not very easily changed in our mindset. That is, of course, when we're born, we are helpless. We learn mostly from our parents, our family, our schools, and we learn in about a very narrow culture, if you like, and it's very hard to change. I think that's probably a species thing. That is, you learn about the harms that can come to you if you do something outside of what your parents have told you to do. That means it's been very difficult for us to effect change, because people really find it hard to believe, and then hard to change their whole mindset and then their habits, of course. And it's the habits that we want to change. Trying to motivate that change has been really, really difficult. In fact, after Peter's book in the late 70s, and then, as is described, the setting up of animal liberation groups, and of course there are other groups as well that were working with us, as Peter said, through what was then the Australian Federation of Animal Societies and within their own groups. They started down that course, and the farmers reacted. And I'm talking here particularly about farming animals, because much of what needed to change was that routine system that was in place. What we found was that they understood that animal welfare was emerging, and that we needed to update the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act and such things, which we set about doing. What the farmers and the agricultural ministers that they influenced, if you like, what they first decided to do was to set up codes of practice, model codes of practice, in order to document the way they were treating animals at that time. Battery cages, sow stalls, farrowing crates, high stocking densities in meat chickens, for example. They documented all of those things in codes of practice, step one, Step 2, they moved on to be part of reviewing very old animal welfare legislation from the early 19th century. And so when they did that, what they did was put in a defence for anything done under a code of practice. Remember, they'd done step 1, they then did step 2, which was to ensure that anything done under a code of practice would not be classified as cruelty. And so, to some extent, that was the backlash, that was the embedding, if you like, of some routine and very bad practices. So we, the animal movement, have tried to change tactics over time. We first thought that politicians were the way to go. What we then learnt was that and you look to politicians to change laws, of course you do, and we saw that the laws were not helping animals. It's logical, but of course no doubt I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Politicians usually follow trends rather than lead them. Obviously there's some exceptions to that, and we see people within the Parliament today that are trying to do that, including the Animal Justice Party, of course, and before them, and also the Greens have better policies than many of the others, and in the past the Australian Democrats assisted. One of the things I wanted to talk about, just in a timeline if you like, was the 1980s, which is when I first got involved in the movement. It was just starting off. As Peter said, the Federation started in 1980. I joined 2 years later. But one of the first things, and this goes down to Chris Townend and others as well, was to influence Don Chipp, the Australian Democrats founder and leader at the time, to set up a Senate Select Committee on Animal Welfare. We thought that would gain political attention, and of course being an ongoing inquiry, that's what a select inquiry is, would mean that we could have a forum to put information forward on animal welfare issues, document them, find the research, put it together, and we did that. Together we did that. That was really when, while the Federation helped to pull it together, each of the member societies who had special expertise in different areas actually helped us put it together. When you look at those submissions now, we did 5 volumes of submissions over 100 different issues, and the Senate inquiry itself ran for 9 years and produced 11 reports. When you look back now, it's really scant. You might know that the animal welfare research was only just getting going, and mainly in Europe and England, certainly not here. And so we were using as evidence photocopies of things that we've seen in newspapers, or the very rare research that had been done. And so there wasn't a lot to put forward, but we did that. And so if you like, we documented. And I'm proud to say that what was the Australian Federation of Animal Societies was said to have provided the benchmark submissions. So I think we came of age to an extent. But of course, going back to my first point, it really didn't mean that we were going to change the world, although we thought it would. That went through the 1980s and the early 1990s. In the 1990s, as Gonzalo talks about, of course, there were more of the exposés, raids or sit-ins and such things, that is trying to bring what was happening, in this case factory farming, but live export was in there as well, other issues, the occasional animal research action. That was in order to try to bring it to attention, to community attention, because as I said, until there was greater awareness, the politicians were not going to listen to us, and certainly the producers were not going to listen to us and change their practices. And that really did start to make it a public issue, more than it was before. But we still had so far to go. There were a few things that happened through that time, but not a great deal apart from the rate. That is, things you could tick off to say we've achieved that. By the 2000s, though, things were starting to move to an extent, and that's also because we, just talking about the Federation, now were able to undertake overseas investigations on live export, for example, and actually bring information, video information back. It's very interesting that I could talk to you for hours about some of the ministers for agriculture that we'd spoken to. 1 year and the next year brought back investigation footage, and their whole demeanour changed. and indeed one of the things we did achieve was a ban on exports to Egypt at one stage after a 2006 investigation. And it was quite interesting that we showed the footage to the Minister and he still decided not to do anything with it. So when 60 Minutes was going to air on Sunday evening at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, the Minister made that decision. So it was a combination of the right information, an ability to get it out to the media, and then a Minister taking an action. The 2010s, what we're in at the moment, is very different, and you all know that. And what we do know, and Gonzalo talks about the different strategies, is that we're using all sorts of strategies now. We're using community awareness, we're using social media to a large degree, and that has really changed things over the years, over these last few years, because we have an ability to get to people, to motivate them, to keep them interested on an ongoing basis, which was very different to what was happening in earlier years. For example, just to tell you about through the 1980s when we would want to put out a press release. Remember, there's no email here, guys. And what we found was that the media outlets were not really listening, not really happy for us to be ringing them up and whatsoever. So we would, myself and a colleague, Steph Geddes, there were only two of us working in Federation at the time, and she was part-time. We would actually print out media releases, both of us jump in a car, and we would go to 3OW, 3LO, if you remember what that was, to each of the television stations, and I'd be driving, she'd jump out, she'd run in and give them the media release and run out again, and we'd keep going like that because that was the way you got things out. I mean, that's so different to what would happen now. But it was the only way, and so it was a very different world that we were working in at the time. Peter mentioned the Battery Hen campaign, and I recall back in 2000 when the last review, 17 years ago, when the last review of the poultry code of practice was in place, and it was the only campaign, if you like, that made me cry because it was really difficult, full on, and we thought we had a shot at it. The European Union had just decided that it was going to phase out battery cages. They did that in 1999, and Switzerland and others had already done it. So, and science was much better then. We've moved on. We had 20, 30 years of science. It was very clear, if it wasn't clear to anybody else, that putting hens in a wire cage was not a good idea. And so we thought we'd have a shot at it, but it was, even then, it was so different. And the very last meeting where the ministers, agriculture ministers from each state, made a decision on these things, sitting around a table, we actually thought we had a shot at it. But in the week leading up to it, there was just myself and Simone Gray. You won't know her, but she was with Animal ACT. We actually camped in Senator Andrew Bartlett's office in Brisbane, used all of their resources. We had none of our own, used all of their resources to be able to try and continue to lobby and get media and such things. We didn't have a setup. This time, 2017, Animals Australia, and not just Animals Australia, of course, Voiceless, HSI, RSPCA Australia are all working on this as well, and many others, Animal Liberation, New South Wales and others. But we at the Federation, Animals Australia, have 1.6 million Facebook followers, over 500,000 people on our email lists, and video editors that are just amazing, that can put things together and get out to people. We're doing Facebook advertising, we're doing newspaper advertising, we're going to be doing TV advertising. It's just chalk and cheese. It's so different. The rub will be that we still have a biased system in place. We have agricultural ministers whose constituency are farmers, as well as being so-called animal welfare ministers responsible for animal welfare. So we have a biased system in place that's become very obvious through this particular code review process, which is to become standards and regulations. So it's a really difficult situation. So while our ammunition, our strategies are not that complex and great, totally different to what they were back then. We still have a bias system in place, and so whether or not we're able to have the politicians understand the welfare issues, the very being of these animals, that is trying to give them a life worth living, whether we're able to do that is still a question. So as a social movement, we still have a long way to go. And indeed, because of greater demand for animal products, some of the numbers have gone up. Certainly there's been a raise in awareness. For example, Peter talked about the difficulty of being able to buy free-range eggs, to recognise and buy free-range eggs back when animal liberation was, the groups were starting. That has changed to some extent. In 2000, in the year 2000, about 5% of eggs were free-range being sold in supermarkets. Just this last year, we've got to something over 50%. So that's just consumer changes, community awareness changes. So that's terrific. But there's still 50% that are still in cages. It's unbelievable in 2017, but that's where we are. I think I've run out of time. I have. I wanted to say that having Gonzalo's book, and yes, it took me back down memory lane, of course, and remembering many of my colleagues in the past and remembering what they've done. I think that things have changed so significantly, but we still have so far to go. But to just sit back and think about the strategies that we have been using, that have been working, that haven't been, is so important. One of the first things that, in fact, it was Patty Mark who said to me when she was doing some work for the Federation before I commenced, and one thing that she said to me at the time was, she said, look, even though you'll have all of this administration and lobbying and such to do, the thing you can never forget to do is to read and learn about what others are doing and what strategies there are. And of course that's always been the case. It's still the case right now. We work with a lot of the overseas groups. They increasingly are taking up some of our strategies and we theirs. And it's so important because it's a moving feast. The tools we have available to us, the way people learn and listen and take their news has changed significantly, and so we have to remember to change continually. So to finish, looking at my notes for the first time, what we need to do, of course, is to have the issues that are not usually spoken about get public traction. And that's the challenge we have. We have a basic human abhorrence for cruelty. We have that to work with. That's the foundation. If you ask anybody whether or not they think cruelty is a good idea, they'll say no. So we have that. What we then need to do, of course, is to use that natural affinity for animals, put it into action to protect animals, and to give animals a life worth living, and that's our challenge. And thank you, Gonzalo, very much for your book, because it helps this conversation and will help us to ensure that we refine our strategies to the best we can for animals. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Finally, I'd like to welcome to the stage Gonzalo Villanueva to say a few words and to launch his book. He is a Gilbert Postdoctoral Career Development Fellow at the University of Melbourne, and he completed his PhD here at the University in 2016. His thesis, A Voice for Animals, the Creation, Contention and Consequences of the Modern Australian Animal Movement, 1970 to 2015, offered the first historical study of the Australian animal movement and was the foundation for this book. So all those doing your PhDs, It's very fantastic if you are working in an area of social protest or human rights, that there are many more avenues, I think, now open with publishers to publish. In fact, many publishers now have series around animal issues as well as social justice issues. He's just returned from the Victorian wetlands, participating in this year's duck rescue campaign. I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming him to talk.
Hey, thank you, Barbara. I know it's not the Academy Awards, but I'll try to stick to my allocated times before the music starts playing me out. And I don't really have much to say. I feel like our speakers have said a number of really interesting things, and we have a Q&A session that I feel like I really want to get to. So I'll just be really quick with what I want to say. First of all, I just want to thank the Human Rights and Animal Ethics Research Network, and particularly Barbara and Lynn for organising tonight. Peter and Glenys as well. Thank you so much for agreeing to launch this book. It's an amazing event. I'm really pleased that we could put this on for everyone. Certainly, there are many other people that I could thank. They're all in the acknowledgements of my book. But I suppose that's, I could read out a list, and that might not mean much to many people. So anyway, it's there. I feel like I should talk about why I wrote this book. I think that's probably the more interesting thing. And I'll take you back to 2012 or 2011 when I had just finished my honours thesis in sociology, and I was looking to write a PhD, get into a PhD, and I thought of a number of things, and certainly animal rights was there at the time, but not at the forefront. And it just happened to be that there was an opportunity to think about the place of the movement in Australian history, and I think the topic I came up with was looking at the diffusion of animal rights across the United States, the UK, and Australia. This is a huge topic that was just ridiculous, but somehow it got accepted. I really don't know. Someone brought us down and they were like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's give this guy some money and a position to write that. And eventually, history wasn't on my agenda then, but it was really through meeting other historians and being part of a stream that we had at the time called Researching in the Past. I don't know if that stream still runs today, but it was immersed in that environment of thinking about history, thinking about the role that history can play, that I decided to really kind of take my project into a historical kind of turn. And it was aided immensely because there was actually no history book on the movement. So I really had to start thinking about, well, what is this history? Where did this movement come from? Why did it emerge? What is its story? What kind of methods did activists use to contest their cause? And what were the consequences of that movement? Those were the questions that I decided to settle on. And that is the kind of substance of this book and the substance of my thesis. So along the way, I got to meet Peter, and he was very generous with his time, and met many other people. Glenys was quite willing to let me come and rummage through the records in Australia. So that was obviously a very important thing. And many other actors were quite generous in telling me their stories. This book is really it is their stories that needed to be told, and I'm immensely pleased. I'm very pleased that I could be the one to tell that story. But there is an opportunity for other historians to come along and study this movement. I'm certainly, this isn't the definitive edition. This is hopefully one of many history books on a social movement that I think has been quite neglected by historians, and yet it is one of the most significant movements in Australia today. I've got 3 copies to sell. Unfortunately, it is an expensive hardback, and it is marketed at an academic audience, but as Peter has said, you can find it in your university library, and if you'd like to come up and purchase it for half price of $70, unfortunately, then please come and help me pay off my credit card debt. Anyway, thank you, and I think we could probably move on to the Q&A part. Anyway, thank you.
So we have about 10 to 15 minutes. Questions? Yes.
First, I want to say thank you to Peter and Glenys for your presentations, and also congratulations on the Parliament book. Very fantastic achievement. I wanted to pick up on something that Glenys said about animal welfare bureaus or bodies often being housed in the agriculture portfolios, and the problems that has presented to advocates of animal welfare and animal protection. I'm not sure, well, I'm sure you're aware, but the Productivity Commission at the federal level late last year released a report into the Australian agriculture industry, and one of the recommendations coming out of that report is to establish an animal welfare body that's independent of an agriculture portfolio, and I just wanted to give the panel's reflections on that and if we think that's the step in the right direction.
Oh, look, it's terrific. The Productivity Commission, when they're looking at regulation of agriculture, looked across the board. It was a whole lot of things. Animal welfare was just one of about 10 issues they looked at. But yes, as you say, Kaylee, they recommended what we've come to call an independent office of animal welfare. They're calling it something different. And they brought out the bias that I talked about, not just in the departments, but also during the code review process that I talked about in regard to the current battery code one, for example. So that was terrific for an independent body like that to do it. But of course, that report at the time went to Barnaby Joyce, and will go to the new minister, David Littleproud. And again, you have a built-in system that will probably say no. But I think it's terrific that they did that, and I'm very pleased that the AJP, I'm pointing to Bruce Payne, who's here from the AJP, are taking that issue up, and some others have also, the Greens have also taken that up. So we'll just keep pushing on that.
I basically agree with Glenys on that. I mean, one thing that can be said is that if you have it in the Ag department and you actually manage to persuade the minister to do something, it happens, right? Whereas if you have it independently, you're then going to have some fight in cabinet, presumably, as to whether it will actually happen. But and there have been things like what I just talked about getting the Victorian Egg Board basically abolished, or getting it at least not to have a monopoly of the sale and distribution of eggs, was done through the Victorian Department of Ag. Minister, I think Ian Smith, you talk about in the book, I think it was pretty aware of these issues. wasn't that bad. There was a pretty good public service head of the department, I think, who was involved in that. So you can get some things done, but yes, on the whole, clearly they have a bias. They see their brief as protecting the interests of farmers, so that makes it hard.
I'll just add to that there's no shortage of reports on animal welfare or on areas that can be improved. And one of the things that I cover in my book, and certainly both Peter and Glenys would know quite a lot about, is other reports that came out of the Select Senate Committee on Animal Welfare, starting in 1985 up until 1991. So a number of recommendations came out of those reports. Good recommendations, some, well, they started off being good and then they declined a little bit. But it really comes down to, what actions, the federal state governments are going to take, and I think you can only begin to evaluate those kind of outcomes from then on.
Another question on this, I just want to blow your trumpet for you because you're probably too humble to do it for you yourself. How many submissions did Animals Australia end up getting for the poultry code review in the end?
Do you not say that?
No.
Yeah, the poultry standards are out for public consultation, and the review period just finished. And we know that we got something like about 150,000 people to put in submissions, and other organisations, as I said before, was able to do that as well. We think that in the end about 200,000 written submissions will be going to that review, and that's about 5 times the number of submissions than in any previous similar consultation. So we blew them away. So that's the community speaking. So of course, it will still be up to the agricultural ministers eventually to make a decision. So we will continue the pressure. Thank you very much. My own cheers quite a lot.
Do you have an estimate of what percentage of them were against the cage?
99.9.
Oh, wow.
No, I mean, that's an estimate, but yeah, we do know that the vast majority, obviously, there'll be industry submissions in there as well. The industry, well, it's not just one industry, but just talking about the egg industry, which is a part of it, they certainly decided that they're not going to do anything substantive, except they did say that they would not put any, they'd put a pause on putting any more cages in until they could convince the community that they were not cruel devices. So, good luck with that.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for that. Just a very specific question about the battery cages. I was watching something on TV a few weeks ago where there were farmers talking about furnished cages. I don't know if that's a term that's still in here. Kind of just quite some strange pictures in one's mind. But
It's a little bed setter, it's fine.
Technically up on it. But the farmers seem to be saying that the ones who are interviewed were some extolled virtues of this, as far as animal welfare is concerned, also said that nobody's going to cover this because it makes it too expensive. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Furnished cages, they're sometimes called enriched cages or colony cages. It just means usually a bigger cage, but with more chickens in it, with a perch and sort of like a little square so-called nest box, and sometimes a litter tray. But not much more space, and difficulty moving around. Obviously that's not as bad, not the worst, not as bad as battery cage, but it's still a cage. And certainly it doesn't provide all of the requirements or the needs or the behavioural needs of chooks. So we certainly don't support furnished cages, and you'll find that each of the major animal welfare groups around the world, Compassion World Farming for example, and others, are opposed to furnished cages. We don't think that they're going to take a hold in any event, simply because they are more expensive, and the community, after all, will see that a cage is a cage is a cage.
Yes.
Do you think there's much prospect of furthering the cause by linking it to human rights movements, not in the sense of saying that animals are human, but in the sense of saying that because of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that our livestock industries produce, the amount of water consumption, that you're actually impinging on the human rights of future generations, possibly our own generations, but definitely our children's generations, our grandchildren's generations, if in fact we exacerbate climate change to the extent that we're ruining our environment, which seems to be the case with a lot of industries. Is there much prospect of that interaction with the government departments and possibly through the courts and try to link it to human rights?
It's probably, well, Peter's probably got views on this too. Certainly we need to use every tactic that we can, and already Animals Australia and many other animal welfare groups are pointing out these things, that is the environmental and the health elements of consuming animals, which of course, if we're able to reduce the consumption of animals, then you would obviously by portion reduce animal suffering. So we certainly are trying. I think you're right. Peter might have.
Yeah, I'm certainly very concerned about climate change, and I think in terms of trying to persuade people not to eat not to eat beef basically, or lamb. Those are ruminant animals that produce a lot of greenhouse gases, and applies to dairy as well to a significant extent. So those are important arguments. But the problem with it from an animal welfare point of view is that if you're really talking about climate change, chickens don't really get in there. Right? Chickens do not produce methane in the way that ruminants do. And in terms of general efficiency, the fossil fuels you need to expend to grow grain, for example, and feed it to animals, chickens are also more efficient than cattle. They're still inefficient. You still have to feed them maybe 3 times as much food value as you get out of them. But still, a lot of the arguments, if you really would only focused on climate change, would be to say, people would go around saying, don't eat beef, eat chicken instead. And from an animal welfare point of view, that's disastrous. Because firstly, there are a lot more sentient creatures who are suffering, because a lot less meat on one chicken, obviously. And secondly, they're generally in worse conditions because they're indoors, intensively reared. Cattle, at least part of their lives, and in Australia for most of their lives, are outdoors on range. But not saying they don't suffer in a whole lot of ways. They do, but I'd have to say that the life of an Australian beef animal is better than the life of a chicken. So that's what worries me about that argument. Not that I won't use it when people say things like, well, it's okay to eat cows and that they have a decent life. Then I'll certainly use it. But I'm cautious about that.
Yes.
I'd like to know if there's a vision for how farming is going to change. Are we going to see a change to more tree crops type foods in areas like along rivers where traditionally there's been animals because they can be moved if there's a flood? Do you have a vision for how farms are going to change?
Peter?
So I think the really big revolution is not what you mentioned. It's going to be the production of plant-based and in vitro so-called cultured meat from animal cells that are cultured. Sometimes it's called clean meat now because it's not going to be contaminated with animal feces and salmonella and so on as animal products are now. And there are huge amounts of money going into this. There's a lot of venture capital going from people who think that this is going to transform agriculture in the way that we've seen technology transform so many other industries. See why newspapers are on the back foot because of the internet, for example. And if you can get plant-based or in vitro development of products that satisfy the taste that still seems to be out there in the public for meat-like products, this is going to, and if that can be done economically, then I think this really could completely transform animal agriculture. We'll still need to produce plants to turn these for plant-based products or whatever it is that you're going to feed the culture on to turn into meat-like products. But yeah, it could really dramatically reduce the amount of animal agriculture that we have. It could make that difference for climate change that we were just talking about, because I've seen studies saying that cultured meat will have only 3% of the greenhouse gas emissions of beef or lamb at present. It will reduce animal suffering, it will reduce pollution, and so on. So I would see that as happening, more than shifts to different kinds of tree crops.
I'd just like to say thank you so far for all of your thoughts. You have a wealth of experience, and if you were to consider that the human species was not the top of the food chain, how could or should that change our minds as an ethical principle?
I'm sure that's yours.
It does have the word ethics in there. Yeah. So I think the idea of who's the top of the food chain is really, I guess, a matter of mindset, because you could see the food chain really as a cycle after all. You know, I mean, if we get buried, then the worms at the top of the food chain if they're eating us. I don't see that as the mindset. I see, as I described in Animal Liberation, I see a lot of other things contributing to the idea that we're the important ones. I see religious ideas contributing to that, the idea that we alone have an immortal soul, that God gave us dominion over the animals, that we alone are made in the image of God. I see those things contributing to dominance and our feeling entitled to use animals in the way we do. I also see, I guess, just a certain kind of apathy or indifference to beings that don't look like us, and that's an extension of what we already know through our understanding of racism, of less concern for humans who don't look like us or seem foreign or different in their culture and dress and other things. And when you push it out to other species, then you get even more of that. So to me, it's those kinds of mindsets that we need to change, that we need to have a more egalitarian sort of attitude of concern for the interests of non-human animals. That's what I've been pushing, and you know, I think that has got other antecedents as well. I just criticise some religious views, but if you think of Buddhism as a religion, and Buddhism is one world outlook, I'd rather think of it as a sort of philosophical outlook, that does, at least in theory anyway, if not always in practice, have more equal compassion for sentient beings.
Yes, right.
Just to come back to what Peter was saying with the previous question about farming evolving, I suppose, talking about clean meat, something I think that the general public seem to bring up a lot of the time when you talk about things like abolishing cages for, egg-laying hens and things of that nature. In Australia, a lot of the time people react with, oh, but what about the farmers? They're going to lose jobs and all that kind of thing. How do you anticipate government might react to agriculture moving in that direction?
I'm not sure, but it's the political coalition that governs us now, which is the one in which farmers have the most interest, has the most influence, I should say, is also the one which is more committed to the idea of free enterprise and not so much state interference in industry and economy. And I find it hard to see that a government would actually prohibit the manufacture and sale of these products, especially if they're shown to be environmentally beneficial and if people are shown to want them. I suppose there may be efforts to get them to be prohibited, but I'd really be surprised if that would succeed.
Can I just add, when I was looking into the live export saga that happened, that unfolded here in the 1970s, I was looking at the papers of the Australasian Meat Industry Employees Union and came across a discussion paper, totally unrelated to live export, but that is relevant to this discussion, a discussion paper looking at the potential rise of synthetic meat. So this was in 1968, and the proposal that was put forward at the time was to buy patents of synthetic meat to prohibit them coming into the market. So if you take that thread and run with it, then you can see a future in which perhaps there already are people looking to buy patents on certain forms of clean meat, industry resistance to these kinds of innovations, and this was the union. This wasn't even a meat body, a kind of industry meat body. So
well, that's interesting. I mean, so among those investors in what I was talking about, plant-based and cultured meat, is Tyson Industries, which is the largest meat producer in the world. And they've bought a percentage of Memphis Meats, is it? Do you remember? One of those companies, anyway. But what their CEO has said is that we are promoting all kinds of meat production, and we think we ought to have an investment in this because it's something that could be important. we certainly not said we're going to do this in order to protect the rest of our industry. And I don't know, I think that would produce a lot of resistance, I think, if anyone really attempted to buy up patents to prevent the products being developed. I'm not sure. I'm not saying it's impossible. But.
So the patents are actually being under review at the moment.
Right.
For everything, people are trying to put very global patents that cover unicorn meat and, like everything, some clauses in those patents. But there's 3 big patents at the moment, 2 of them by vegan-ish companies. Macmillan.
Yeah, Macmillan.
Yeah, and then one by someone I don't know.
Does clean meat include meat produced? I know it's incredibly expensive at the moment from stem cells.
Yes, that's what I was talking about. Yes,
Right.
cultured meat,
Not
cultured from animal cells. Yeah.
Not food that's made taste just like meat or pretty close.
Yes. Well, it is really meat, right? It is really sort of at the molecular level. It is really meat. It's just produced in a different way, and as you say, so far it's expensive. Although actually the price is coming down quite rapidly.
So how would someone who's been a vegan for 30, 40 years react to somebody eating meat?
Well, they'll have a choice.
There's no one all the time. That's right. You won't be forced to. But, no, I mean, I've sampled veggie burgers which are getting close to meat. They're not actual meat like this. They're not plant-based. Sorry, they're not cultured cells. But and there is, I think maybe she said something that at the moment I think they're using fecal bovine serum or something to grow them in.
They're trying to, there's lots of money going into trying to replace that. But I think 60 years the industry's been trying to replace that. So it's a difficult material. So that's taken from the fetuses of live calves from pregnant dairy cattle.
And have we talked about taking stem cells from ourselves?
Ingrid Newkirk has done that. I think she's put in her will that she wants to, well, because she can take the stem cells before she dies. I think she's put it in her will that she wants to be eaten by people anyway. Which I guess makes the point that you're making, right? That she's saying, I'm not opposed to people eating meat. I'm opposed to people, causing suffering and killing beings who could still have a good life. And certainly there are people who are vegan except that they will eat roadkill. If you come across a deer in New Jersey, it happens quite frequently that has been hit by a car, and here I guess it could be kangaroo. I haven't done it, but I don't have any ethical objection to people who want to do it.
Yes.
Well, perhaps the gentleman over there.
Yes.
Oh, sure. Okay. Firstly, thank you, Gonzalo. And congratulations on this work. It's been one of the study beside you for the last few years. I just had a quick question about the Transnational in the title of the book, and I'm just wondering about how you treated the transnational hatred and kind of connections to wider movements and wider sort of influences.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Henry. It really comes back to my earlier attempt to think about the link between Australia, the UK, and Britain, at least at the time, and America. At least at the time, that was very much kind of a theoretical question. I didn't really know much about it. But over time, over the course of doing this research, I certainly began to kind of identify and note a number of connections between Australians and activists overseas. As I kind of discussed in my book, I think one of the best examples that I can think of is the kind of creation of open rescue here in Australia in the 1990s with Paddy Marr going into sheds, willingly going into shed, revealing her identity and being prepared to be arrested for her actions. And that was seen as by the Americans in the late 90s and so in 2000s, the North Americans as a model worth emulating over there, and taken up by several activists in the US, practiced there, refined, and in some ways later abandoned as well because it didn't suit their conditions. They preferred, rather than going into the intensive farms, to stage a raid, at least from my research, to opt for the undercover investigations, so seeking employment, documenting kind of those kind of acts of cruelty in that way. So that's kind of where the transnational kind of element came into this book. And there are certainly other kind of episodes of that nature there.
Yeah, and you talk about sort of the influence on me that I had when I was at Oxford, which then I guess I brought back to Australia through animal liberation.
Yeah.
Friends, it didn't happen here in Australia in isolation from the rest of the world, that's obvious.
No, certainly not.
Well, that's all we have time for. I was just thinking, maybe I'm wrong, but I think is this a topic that Q&A on Monday night has never touched? We should all
Peter
write
did
in.
on Q&A.
I talked about animals on Q&A, but not as a major
As a major topic, we
like
should all
that.
write in and say, we want an evening on this whole issue, because education's a fantastic thing. People can have their minds changed while they're watching. So thank you ever so much. Pity we can't go longer, but we've only got the theatre now. So thank you